Good evening, Dr. Mel. This is Marvin Ponce, student of Doctor in Sustainability. I'm here now presenting FMA3 presentation for an ACM program, Aligning CSR and Climate Justice for Indigenous Peoples. So here is the outline of my presentation, the introduction, Climate Justice and Indigenous Peoples, CSR and Indigenous Peoples, Aligning CSR and Climate Justice for Indigenous Peoples Framework, and the conclusion. Corporate Social Responsibility, or CSR, for Indigenous Peoples involves a range of activities that aim to promote the well-being and rights of Indigenous communities while also respecting their cultural heritage and traditions. Effective CSR initiatives often focus on sustainable development, environmental protection, and social inclusion, ensuring that Indigenous communities benefit from the economic development while preserving their unique way of life. For years, the importance of Indigenous peoples in the fight against deforestation, land degradation, and climate change were overlooked and even denied, to the detriment of the environment and the food system on which we all depend. Thanks to the global advocacy of Indigenous peoples and their organization, this tendency is changing, though not fast enough. Indigenous knowledge systems and languages contribute directly to biological and cultural diversity, poverty eradication, conflict resolution, food security, and ecosystem health, and serve as the foundation of the resilience of Indigenous communities to the impact of climate change. Their awareness of traditional food sources and the fundamental connection between food systems and healthy landscapes can help to promote diets that are diverse and sustainable. So, for climate justice and Indigenous peoples' relationship, climate change has been recognized as the most important global public health concern of our time. And the consequences and burdens of this crisis are faced disproportionately by certain racial and ethnic groups. Indigenous peoples are considered among the most vulnerable to climate change due to their dependency with their local ecosystems, as well as increasing morbidity from the long-term effects of health disparities. Climate justice for Indigenous peoples recognizes that they are disproportionately impacted by climate change due to their close relationship with the environment and historical injustices like dispossession. It emphasizes the need to respect Indigenous knowledge, protect their rights, and ensure their full participation in climate action in decision-making processes. For the impacts of climate change to Indigenous peoples, so Indigenous peoples' close relationship with nature provides them with knowledge about environmental changes. However, despite early warning signs of global warming, Indigenous peoples still experience the devastating effects of climate change. Indigenous peoples live in fragile, vulnerable territories and ecosystems, bearing the brunt of climate change impacts. The UN notes that the Indigenous peoples are the first to experience the dire consequences of climate change. So impacts includes political and economic marginalization, loss of land and resources, human rights violation, discrimination, and unemployment. Indigenous women and children are also particularly vulnerable and affected. So what is CSR relationship with the Indigenous peoples in solving climate problems? For Indigenous peoples, prosperity is intimately connected to cultural preservation, environmental balance, and the acceptance of their rights. For businesses, prosperity involves a long-term expansion and innovation. When corporations cooperate with Indigenous communities, they can combine ancient understanding with modern processes and resulting in mutual benefits. Indigenous peoples benefit from this collaboration by receiving cultural affirmation and long-time opportunity, while corporations benefit from enhanced sustainability strategy. Together, they can forge a route to mutual well-being. In the context of CSR, expressions of stakeholder engagement need to be strengthened. Corporations still get to decide the stakeholders with whom they wish to engage, what engagement looks like, and what they ultimately may decide to do after having consulted with any particular stakeholder, depending on how well the stakeholders' interests align with the priorities of the business. Corporate social responsibility, or CSR, is vital for indigenous peoples as it promotes ethical business practices, supports sustainable development, and empowers communities. CSR initiatives can help bridge the gap between economic progress and cultural and environmental well-being of indigenous communities, fostering a more inclusive and equitable society. Furthermore, CSR can promote environmentally sustainable practices in business operations, helping to protect natural resources and ecosystems that are vital for indigenous cultures and livelihood. This includes initiatives focused on water conservation, waste management, and sustainable resource management. So for the framework, for the aligning CSR and climate justice for indigenous peoples, to explain it further, despite their critical position as the primary protectors of global biodiversity, businesses frequently overlook indigenous peoples as important stakeholders, collaborators, or right holders. As things stand, corporate activity frequently results in unfair land grabs, resources extraction, and the displacement of indigenous people. This framework on the right is based on the acknowledgement of indigenous people's rights and the significance of their wisdom as biodiversity custodians. It builds the groundwork for sustainable capitalism by presenting a systematic approach to climate justice that positions indigenous peoples as agents of enterprises striving to preserve assets and resources that support a wide range of sectors. So, for the step one of the theoretical framework regarding aligning CSR and climate justice for indigenous peoples, for building a social community partnership, the framework begins with businesses acknowledging indigenous peoples as crucial stakeholders and rights holders. To lay the foundation for mutually beneficial partnership, businesses need a much deeper understanding of how indigenous people differ from other communities and ethnic minorities. By respecting and understanding components integral to indigenous people's livelihoods, including land, traditional food sources, infrastructure, self-determination, traditional knowledge, culture, language, education, and water access, business can work to help safeguard them. In this framework, businesses strive to effectively operate within planetary boundaries through a cycle of acknowledgement, action, and accountability, transparency in their interaction with indigenous peoples. Since many policies are crafted and implemented at the local level, which gives rise to numerous localized adaptation of the planetary boundaries framework, it can be beneficial to establish boundaries that apply to specific regional context. For the step two, to develop a community planning, the Indigenous Peoples Plan, or the IPP, outlines the socio-economic, health, education, and environmental profile of the indigenous community, including their circumstances, livelihoods, capacities, natural resources, social norms, and cultural heritage. It also outlines potential impacts and opportunities, including job opportunities, infrastructure development, and environmental protection. The IPP also includes a summary of community consultation, natural resource management, and cultural heritage management plans. It also outlines the cost, timeline, and responsibility for implementing and monitoring the IPP. The plan aims to mitigate adverse impacts and enhance opportunities for the indigenous community. Adverse impacts on indigenous groups should be avoided where possible. The primary purpose of the Indigenous Peoples Plan is to outline culturally appropriate impact prevention and where impacts on indigenous peoples are unavoidable, mitigation measures, as well as identify opportunities to maximize sustainable benefits to the indigenous community and beyond. Step 3 for program implementation. During this action phase of this framework, indigenous peoples are empowered as businesses operationalize a deeper understanding of their culture and rights while implementing the FPIC or free, prior, and informed consent processes to ensure indigenous peoples play a central role in the decision making. This involves active stakeholder engagement in which indigenous perspectives and aspirations are heard, which leads to sustainable business activity being collaboratively conducted with permission and respect for indigenous rights, knowledge, and cultural practices, while acknowledging the importance of sharing resources and benefits and collaboratively working to operate supply chains that safeguard indigenous lands and territories, resources, and livelihoods, which necessitates the use of inclusive trade policies. Collaboration conducted during this phase of the cycle must support the fair distribution of wealth derived from land use, entrepreneurship, technology development, and knowledge sharing. For the last part of this framework, for the step 4 program evaluation, the final phase of this framework encompasses how an organization formulates its strategy and governance structure, along with how it manages its performance and evaluates and communicates the impact of business activities on indigenous peoples and the planet. In other words, the accountability and transparency phase is where stakeholder positioning within program effectiveness and improve as businesses transparently communicate with other stakeholders and proactively respond to concerns regarding their activities, choices, and performance. This requires improved disclosure to ensure businesses can be held accountable for their actions. For this theoretical framework, businesses can multiply their interface with indigenous communities and invite knowledge keepers to share their knowledge and help develop cultural literacy about indigenous values and perspective. Businesses can diversify their decision-making bodies to give voice to indigenous peoples in acts of genuine power sharing. While not exhaustive, collectively, these measures represent more meaningful, authentic, and enduring methods of engagement. They stretch the boundaries of existing CSR frameworks through the inclusion of indigenous spiritual and other cultural values as a step forward reconciliation towards a fairer society and towards to a more sustainable future. In closing, by understanding indigenous people's reliance on collective resources, businesses can also identify and mitigate potential operational risk. Meanwhile, respecting indigenous people's traditional knowledge yields valuable insights into sustainable practices, biodiversity, and innovative solutions applicable across various industries. Such respect and understanding manifested through attentiveness to indigenous people's land, culture, and education enhances corporate social responsibility, which attracts consumers and investors that prioritize ethical and sustainable products and services. So here are my references. Again, my name is Marvin Ponce, student of Doctor in Sustainability. Again, Ma'am Mel, thank you for the opportunity that you gave me for this course, and I'm happy to be a part of it. And thank you so much, and God bless.